The night after her husband's funeral, Rachel Harper sat alone in the living room of the sprawling farmhouse, staring at the silence pressing against the windows. The Harper estate, one of the oldest properties in their small Texas town, had always felt more like a museum than a home. With its stiff furniture, walls lined with portraits of unsmiling ancestors, and shelves sagging under the weight of leather-bound ledgers that no one ever seemed to touch. Her husband, Mark, had grown up here, the golden boy of the Harper clan, and though he had never been cruel, Rachel had always felt like an outsider, a guest who might be shown the door at any moment. Now, with him gone, she felt even more adrift, her position in the family uncertain, her future precarious. The Harpers had money, power, and connections woven into every corner of the county, and though they spoke in polite tones, their smiles never quite reached their eyes. She had seen that most clearly at the funeral. His mother, Eleanor, towering and regal even in her grief, had embraced Rachel with icy fingers and whispered, "We'll take care of you, dear," in a way that felt more like a warning than a comfort. Rachel didn't believe her. She didn't trust any of them. When the house had emptied that night, when the last casserole dish had been carried off by neighbors and the family retired to their rooms, Rachel stayed in the living room, listening to the grandfather clock tick like a countdown. She thought of Mark's sudden heart attack, of the way the paramedics had shaken their heads, of the way Eleanor had swept in to take over arrangements as though rehearsed for years. And she thought of the way her mother-in-law had avoided her eyes when Rachel asked simple questions. Where were Mark's personal things? Why had his accounts been sealed so quickly? Why had Eleanor insisted Rachel move into the big house, instead of staying in the modest rental she and Mark had shared? Questions swirled in her head until she could barely breathe. Seeking distraction, she wandered through the darkened house, her hand trailing along the carved wood banister as she climbed to the second floor. Most doors were shut tight, but at the end of the hall, a narrow door stood slightly ajar. Rachel hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before slipping inside. It was a storage room, dust floating in the air, boxes stacked haphazardly, old furniture draped in sheets. In the corner stood an antique roll-top desk, its drawers warped with age. Something about it tugged at her, as though daring her to come closer. She pulled the top open with effort and found stacks of yellowed papers, brittle receipts, and ledgers filled with neat columns of numbers. Harper family business records, she guessed. But at the very bottom of the stack, hidden beneath loose pages, her fingers brushed leather, an old book, bound in dark green, the edges cracked with time. She pulled it free and opened it to find handwriting elegant and precise, looping letters that belonged to Eleanor Harper. Her heart quickened. A journal. She turned to the first page and read, "We built this house on loyalty and silence. What we've done cannot be spoken of in daylight, but it must never be forgotten. So I write, though I know the danger." Rachel's breath caught. She flipped ahead, scanning entries that spoke of land deals with missing signatures, cash changing hands and unmarked envelopes, neighbors who suddenly left town after disagreements, and phrases that made her blood run cold. "We buried it with him, and she never should have crossed us." Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages faster, each entry darker than the last, painting a portrait of a family who had manipulated, threatened, and even eliminated those who stood in their way. This wasn't just gossip. These were confessions, written by the matriarch herself. The widow's ledger, Rachel thought suddenly. It wasn't just record-keeping. It was an archive of sins. The creak of a floorboard behind her snapped her head up. The door was no longer ajar, it was open wider. Her chest tightened as she shoved the journal back into the desk, but it was too late. Eleanor's silhouette filled the doorway, her silver hair gleaming in the dim light. Her eyes flicked to the desk, then back to Rachel. "Couldn't sleep?" Eleanor's voice was velvet over steel. Rachel forced a smile, her palms damp. "Just wandering. This house is hard to get used to." Eleanor stepped into the room, her gaze lingering on the half-closed desk. "It has its secrets," she said softly, then reached out to close the roll top with a firm snap. Best to leave them alone. Rachel's pulse thundered in her ears as Eleanor's hand lingered on the desk, then withdrew. The older woman turned, her heels clicking against the wooden floor as she left the room. Rachel waited until the sound faded before letting out a shaky breath. She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling the thrum of her heart. She hadn't been caught, not entirely, but Eleanor knew. She knew Rachel had found something, or at least that Rachel had been too close. The journal's words seared into Rachel's mind. We built this house on loyalty and silence. She returned to her room that night with the knowledge that her husband's death was only the surface of something deeper, something dangerous. And if Eleanor's ledger truly held the family's darkest secrets, then Rachel had just stumbled onto the one thing they would kill to protect. Rachel couldn't shake the sensation that Eleanor's eyes were still on her, even though the woman had left the kitchen hours ago. The journal lay hidden under a loose floorboard in Rachel's bedroom now, wrapped in an old towel, its weight pressing down on her chest every time she thought about it. She had flipped through only a handful of entries, but already the ledger whispered of betrayals, of sudden disappearances in the neighborhood, of debts paid not with money but with silence. Each name she recognized from passing conversations, from funerals where Eleanor had shed a single tear and then quickly moved on. She tried telling herself that maybe it was just a paranoid record of grievances, but the meticulous notes, the dates, the outcomes, it was a damning chronicle. That night, Rachel barely slept. When she woke, her decision was made. She would investigate, quietly, carefully, because she had to know what she had married into. The first step seemed simple: confirm whether one of the entries was true. She chose a neighbor mentioned early in the journal, Mr. Callahan, who supposedly choked on his own lies. The entry was dated 10 years back, and yet the phrasing suggested something more deliberate than accident. She asked a few casual questions at the market, pretending to be curious about local history. But the reaction was immediate and unsettling. The grocer froze, then said sharply, "Best not to dig up the past, dear." When Rachel pressed, the woman leaned closer, eyes darting around, and whispered, "You don't want Eleanor knowing you ask such things. Let sleeping dogs lie." Rachel forced a smile, purchased her bread, and left, heart pounding. That evening, she told herself she had to be bolder. She sought out Mrs. Abernathy, an older neighbor who was known for her gossip. Surely she would relish recounting the scandal. At first, Mrs. Abernathy welcomed her warmly, pouring tea, chattering about gardens and weather. But when Rachel gently asked about Mr. Callahan, the woman's face tightened. "That's not a name we speak here anymore," she hissed, gripping Rachel's wrist with surprising strength. "If you've any sense, you'll keep your curiosity to yourself. This family has long arms, girl. Don't think you're the first to wonder." Rachel pulled back, unsettled, the warning ringing louder than any answer. The next days blurred into a haze of paranoia. Every time she left the house, she felt eyes on her. A man she didn't know lingered too long by the fence when she hung laundry. An old friend of Eleanor's stopped her in town, squeezing her shoulder with a smile that didn't reach the eyes, and murmured, "We take care of our own here. You understand." Rachel began to realize that Eleanor's influence wasn't confined to the household. It spread like roots through the entire community. Yet the more she was warned away, the more determined she became. She started sneaking into the ledger at night, reading by candlelight. Each entry revealed more cruelty: debts forced into bankruptcy, marriages destroyed, even hints of fires and accidents that seemed less accidental with Eleanor's gloating words scrawled beside them. Rachel kept notes of her own now, copying names and dates into a small notebook she hid in her apron pocket. But her secrecy wasn't flawless. One evening, she noticed the ledger was slightly askew under the floorboard, as if someone else had touched it. She froze, blood draining from her face. Had Eleanor searched her room? The very next day, Eleanor asked at breakfast, "You've been busy in town, haven't you, dear? Making new friends? Asking after the past?" Her tone was casual, but the look in her eyes was sharp, knowing. Rachel stammered something about wanting to feel part of the community. Eleanor smiled thinly. "Best to focus on the present, don't you think? The past can be unsettling." The warning was clear, but Rachel could not stop. She felt trapped. Silence meant complicity, but curiosity meant danger. She tried a different route, approaching Michael, her late husband's cousin, who was known to have fallen out with Eleanor years ago. Meeting him in secret was difficult, but she arranged it under the pretense of buying wood from his farm. At first, Michael was suspicious, but when she showed him a copied note from the ledger, his face went pale. "You found it," he muttered. "I thought she destroyed it." Rachel leaned in. So it's true? She wrote all this. She did all this. Michael ran a hand through his hair, shaking. She keeps that ledger as proof, as leverage. People owe her, fear her, and she keeps the record so they never forget. But if she knows you have it, he didn't finish. Instead, he grabbed her arm and urged, burn it. Forget it, or she'll chew you up like the rest. Rachel wanted to trust him, but fear and doubt tangled inside her. Could he be trying to scare her into giving it up? Could he want the ledger for himself? She returned home shaken, her mind racing. That night, Eleanor entered her room without knocking. Rachel quickly shoved her apron notebook under the pillow. Eleanor walked slowly, her fingers trailing along the furniture, then turned to Rachel with a serene smile. It's good you're curious, darling. But some curiosities lead to ruin. I would hate to see you get lost. Her voice was velvet over steel. Rachel managed to nod, forcing a grateful smile, but her heart was hammering. When Eleanor finally left, Rachel collapsed onto the bed, realizing she was no longer just a daughter-in-law under scrutiny. She was prey marked by a predator who had ruled unchallenged for decades. She now knew the truth of the ledger, but every door she knocked on slammed shut. Every ally warned her away, and Eleanor was circling closer. She had stirred a nest of secrets, and now the swarm was rising. Rachel's world had shrunk to shadows and whispers. The ledger was now both her lifeline and her noose. Every night she copied notes in secret. Every day she played the obedient daughter-in-law, smiling when Eleanor spoke, pretending not to feel the sharp edge behind every word. But the walls were closing in. Eleanor's watchfulness grew heavier, neighbors' glances colder, and Rachel felt the ground beneath her becoming quicksand. She needed an ally, someone who didn't flinch at the ledger's truth. But trust had become dangerous currency, and every face seemed a mask. One rainy afternoon, Rachel slipped into the church, desperate for solitude. She sat in a back pew, clutching her small notebook, praying not for salvation but for clarity. The silence was broken by the shuffle of footsteps. Father O'Connor, a weary man with silver hair, approached. "You've been troubled," he said softly. Rachel froze. She had always avoided confiding in him, afraid Eleanor's reach extended even to the pulpit. But his eyes held a tired honesty that made her want to spill everything. She hesitated, then whispered, "If someone keeps records of evil, does that make them guilty, or is it just words on paper?" The priest's face darkened. "Some records are not kept for confession. They are kept for power." She realized then he knew more than he let on. Slowly, trembling, she slid her notebook across the pew toward him, open to the copied passages. He read, his hands tightening on the paper. After a long silence, he exhaled. "I prayed I'd never see these words again." Rachel's heart leapt. "You know?" He nodded. "Years ago, people came to me, terrified. They said Eleanor had ways of binding them, of threatening their families, always with that damned ledger. I urged them to speak out, but fear silenced them. One by one, they fell in line or disappeared." His voice cracked on the last word. Rachel clutched his arm. "Then help me. I can't fight her alone." He looked at her with sorrow. "If she senses I am with you, she'll destroy us both. But perhaps I can give you something." From beneath his robe, he pulled an envelope, worn and yellowed. "A man gave me this before he died, claimed it was proof that Eleanor orchestrated his ruin. I dared not use it, but maybe you can." Rachel opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter detailing a loan, threats, and finally, a fire that had consumed a warehouse with men still inside. At the bottom, a trembling signature, Callahan. The name made Rachel's blood run cold. It matched one of the ledger entries. This was proof. She could feel her pulse in her throat. But even as hope flared, fear smothered it. Possession of such evidence was dangerous. If Eleanor discovered it, Rachel's fate would be sealed. She tucked the letter into her apron, thanking Father O'Connor with a desperation that made him grip her hand firmly. "Be careful," he warned. "You hold a blade, but one slip and it will cut you instead." That night, Rachel barely closed her eyes. Every sound of the house settling, every creak of the hallway boards made her heart stop. She dreamt of flames, of Eleanor's face glowing in the firelight, smiling as neighbors screamed. When morning came, Rachel's resolve hardened. She would use the letter, somehow. But first she needed someone else to verify it, someone beyond Eleanor's circle of fear. She decided to show it to Michael. Meeting him again was risky, but she had no choice. She waited until dusk, when Eleanor left to visit a friend. Rachel hurried to the farm, rain soaking her cloak. Michael eyed her warily, but ushered her inside. When she showed him the letter, his face drained of color. This is what I always suspected," he muttered. Callahan didn't just die in an accident. Eleanor lit that fire herself, or had it done, and she wrote it down because she liked to savor it. Rachel leaned closer. "If we take this to the sheriff," Michael cut her off sharply. "No, don't you see? The sheriff owes her. Half the town does. That letter in the wrong hands will vanish, and you with it." Rachel's throat tightened. "Then what do we do?" Michael hesitated, then whispered, "There is someone. A journalist in the next county. She used to dig into corruption cases, but Eleanor drove her out. If we can get this letter to her, maybe it will finally break Eleanor's hold." Hope flickered again, but with it came fear. Traveling outside the county would raise suspicions. Eleanor would know Rachel had left, and questions would follow. Still, it was the first real path forward. Rachel agreed. They would plan carefully. But when she returned home that night, soaked and trembling, Eleanor was waiting in the parlor. The old woman's smile was calm, almost motherly, but Rachel's blood froze. "Long day, dear? You look like you've been running about in the rain." Rachel forced a laugh, murmuring something about errands, but Eleanor leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "I hope you're not tiring yourself with foolish notions. Sometimes curiosity burns brighter than common sense, and fire consumes more than we bargained for." The word fire struck Rachel like a knife. Did Eleanor know about the letter already? Rachel excused herself quickly, retreating to her room, but the dread gnawed at her. She pulled the letter from her apron and stared at the trembling handwriting of Callahan, the man who had perished in the flames. She now had proof, an ally in Michael, and the tentative guidance of Father O'Connor. But Eleanor's eyes were everywhere, her whispers in every corner of town. Rachel had kindled a spark of rebellion, yet with it came a terrifying truth. Sparks can ignite infernos, and Eleanor had always known how to control the flames. Rachel had clung to the fragile thread of hope the letter offered, believing that with Michael's help and Father O'Connor's cautious guidance, she might yet drag Eleanor's empire into the light. But hope, she was learning, was the cruelest trick. It dangled just far enough to lure her forward, only to snap when she needed it most. The plan to contact the journalist began unraveling the moment whispers spread that Rachel had been seen at Michael's farm. Neighbors stopped speaking when she entered rooms, eyes flicking to her with suspicion or pity. At the market, Mrs. Dobbins sneered, "Running around after old ghosts, are we?" Rachel forced a smile, but her hands shook so badly she dropped her coins. Eleanor's reach was tightening, and the town itself seemed to close ranks against her. When she sought Michael again, she found his farmhouse dark, the door ajar. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, faint but unmistakable. His boots were gone, his bed stripped. He had vanished. On the table lay a single object, a charred scrap of paper, half of Callahan's letter. The rest was ash. Rachel's chest collapsed inward. Eleanor had struck. Michael had either fled or been silenced, and the precious proof was ruined. Rachel still had her copy, hidden in her sewing kit, but she knew Eleanor would hunt it next. Desperation drove her back to Father O'Connor, but the church doors were locked. She pounded until her fists bled, yet no answer came. The next day it was announced he had been sent away on retreat. Rachel knew the truth. He had been removed, exiled by Eleanor's command, perhaps worse. One by one, her allies were disappearing. Alone, she began walking the town in a daze, clutching the journal and the surviving letter close to her chest. Every shadow seemed to lean closer, every voice a warning. Once, at dusk, she caught sight of a figure watching her from the edge of the square, a tall man in a black coat. When she turned to confront him, he was gone. Fear coiled inside her like a serpent. Nights were worse. She heard footsteps outside her window, whispers beneath the floorboards. Once she woke to find her lamp extinguished though she had left it burning. Another night, she discovered muddy boot prints in the hallway, though everyone swore they had been asleep. Eleanor smiled during the day, only deepened the horror. "You look pale, dear," she would say sweetly. "Perhaps too many burdens weighing on your little shoulders?" Rachel longed to scream, to strike, but she bit her tongue until it bled. She could not reveal her defiance too soon. The breaking point came when she returned from the well one morning to find her sewing kit overturned on the floor, thread and needles scattered. The false lining she had stitched to conceal the letter was ripped open. The letter itself was gone. Rachel collapsed, sobbing, clawing at the empty box. It had been her last defense, her only blade against Eleanor's empire, and now it was gone. Panic consumed her. She raced through the house, searching drawers, cupboards, even Eleanor's room, but nothing. At last she found Eleanor in the parlor, sipping tea as if the world were her stage. On the table beside her sat the letter, unfolded, Eleanor's eyes glinting with triumph. "You've been busy," the old woman murmured. "Sneaking, conspiring, playing with fire. Did you truly think you could outwit me, child?" Rachel's throat burned. "You killed them," she whispered. "Callahan, the men in the warehouse, Michael." Eleanor's smile sharpened. "Men die every day. Some are weak, some are foolish, some are in the wrong place at the wrong time. I only record what is already inevitable." She tapped the ledger with a manicured finger. "And you, Rachel, are becoming inevitable yourself." Terror rooted Rachel to the floor. She realized Eleanor was not merely protecting her past. She was orchestrating Rachel's collapse, step by step. The letter stolen, Michael vanished, the priest silenced. Soon Rachel herself would be erased, written into the ledger as another casualty of Eleanor's power. That night Rachel packed what little she could carry and slipped into the darkness. She stumbled through the woods, branches slashing her face, until she reached the edge of the next county. There she found a boarding house, begged for a room, and collapsed on the bed, shaking with exhaustion and grief. But even there, sleep brought no comfort. In her dreams, Eleanor stood at the foot of the bed, ledger in hand, writing her name slowly, letter by letter. Rachel woke screaming, clutching at her throat. The next morning, when she crept downstairs, she overheard two men speaking in the common room. "Strange business," one said. "Sheriff's men asking about a widow, traveling alone. They say she's hysterical, dangerous." Rachel fled before they saw her. Eleanor's reach was longer than she had imagined. Running would not save her. She had only one choice left. She would have to confront Eleanor directly. She could not outrun the ledger. She had to burn it, even if it meant burning herself with it. And so, with her last scraps of courage, Rachel turned back toward the house that had become her prison. Each step felt like walking into her grave. By the time she reached the familiar iron gate, her hands no longer trembled. She knew what she had to do. But as she approached the door, she heard voices within, neighbors gathered, laughter, glasses clinking. Eleanor was hosting a gathering. Rachel froze in the shadows, realizing her nightmare was worse than she imagined. Eleanor was not hiding her crimes. She was celebrating them in plain sight, surrounded by those who had long ago sold their silence. And Rachel, trembling in the night air, understood she was utterly alone. Rachel stood outside the parlor window, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses seeping into the night like poison. Through the glass, she saw them, neighbors, townsfolk, even the sheriff himself, gathered around Eleanor as if she were royalty, their faces lit by the warm glow of the fire. And there, upon the mantel, sat the ledger, its black leather cover gleaming as though it knew she was watching. Rachel's pulse thundered. She realized Eleanor's true power was not just fear, but loyalty bought and bound by secrets. Every person in that room owed her something, or was implicated in her crimes. They would not rise against her. They would protect her, even at the cost of Rachel's life. Still, Rachel forced herself forward. She slipped through the side door, heart pounding, her skirts damp with dew. Her hand gripped the small flask of kerosene she had stolen from the barn. She had no more letters, no more allies. Fire was all she had left. She crept to the doorway, trembling as she stepped into the light. The room fell silent. Every head turned. Eleanor's smile spread slow and wide, a predator scenting blood. "Well," she purred, "the prodigal daughter returns." Rachel's voice quavered but did not break. "This ends tonight." Murmurs rippled among the guests, but Eleanor raised a hand and silence fell. She rose from her chair, the ledger in her grasp like a holy book. "Ends? Oh, my dear, you still don't understand. You are part of this story. I've already written your name. You belong to the ledger as much as anyone else here. Rachel stepped forward, pulling the flask from her cloak. Gasps filled the room. She unscrewed the cap with shaking hands. If I belong to it, then let's end it together. Eleanor's eyes glittered with something like delight. Do you think burning it will free you? Child, the ledger is only paper. The real power lies in memory, in fear, in silence. They don't need the pages, they carry me inside them. Rachel's throat tightened as she looked around the room. The faces of her neighbors, the same people who had once smiled kindly at her, now stared with a mixture of fear and hatred. She realized Eleanor was right. Even if she destroyed the book, the corruption would live on in their silence. But if she did nothing, Eleanor would consume her completely. Her hands trembled as she poured kerosene onto the ledger, the dark leather soaking greedily. Eleanor did not flinch. Instead, she leaned close, whispering, "Do it. Burn it. Burn yourself. Either way, I win." Rachel struck a match, her breath ragged, the flame dancing inches from the soaked cover. In that instant, time slowed, every eye fixed upon her, the weight of generations pressing down. The fire would not just consume paper, it would consume Rachel's last hope, her last chance of proving the truth. Yet as the match wavered, a strange calm washed over her. She understood what Eleanor feared most was not the fire itself, but Rachel's refusal to bend. The ledger had always been Eleanor's weapon, her chain over the town. If Rachel could show them that chains could break, perhaps that would be enough. She dropped the match. Flames leapt, greedy and bright, devouring the ledger. Gasps and cries filled the room as the fire spread across the mantel. Eleanor's face twisted, the mask cracking for the first time. "No," she shrieked, lunging forward. But Rachel stood her ground, the heat searing her skin. The townsfolk scrambled, some fleeing, others frozen in horror. The sheriff shouted for water, but no one moved. In the chaos, Rachel felt a hand seize her wrist, Eleanor's grip, sharp as talons. "You fool," Eleanor hissed, smoke curling around them. "Do you think this saves you? They will remember me. They will always remember." Rachel wrenched free, tears streaming down her face. "Then let them remember me too." She grabbed the burning ledger and hurled it into the center of the room, where it exploded in a shower of sparks. Curtains caught, flames roared upward, smoke filled the parlor. Screams erupted as people shoved past each other in panic. Rachel staggered back, coughing, but Eleanor stood unmoving, her eyes blazing with hatred. For a moment they faced each other through the smoke, two wills colliding. Then the ceiling groaned, and burning plaster crashed between them. Rachel stumbled into the night air, gasping, her body trembling with both terror and exhilaration. Behind her the house roared like a furnace, its windows glowing red. She turned once, seeing Eleanor silhouetted in the flames, standing tall, clutching nothing, the ledger gone at last. Rachel collapsed in the dirt, sobbing, coughing, her lungs filled with smoke. Around her the townsfolk huddled, watching the inferno with wide, fearful eyes. Some whispered prayers, others wept, but none approached her. She realized then she had not won their love or loyalty. She had only shattered the illusion of Eleanor's invincibility, and what came next would depend not on her, but on whether they could live without the chains that bound them. As the flames consumed the last of the house, Rachel knew she had destroyed more than a book. She had destroyed her home, her safety, her past. What remained was uncertain, but it was hers. And yet, even as relief flickered in her chest, a thought pierced her heart like a dagger. Eleanor had survived worse. The morning after the fire, Rachel woke to silence broken only by the faint crackle of embers. She lay on the cold earth, wrapped in a thin blanket someone must have thrown over her in the night. Her body ached with every breath, her throat raw from smoke. She sat up slowly, eyes watering as she turned toward the ruins of the house. Nothing remained but a blackened skeleton, smoke curling into the pale dawn sky. The parlor, the rooms of her childhood, the place where her mother had once read her stories. All gone, consumed by her own hand. The townsfolk lingered at a distance, huddled in uneasy clusters. No one approached her. She felt their eyes darting her way, quick and fearful, as if she carried the fire inside her still. Whispers rippled. Some said she was brave, others that she was mad. A few claimed Eleanor's spirit had entered her, that she would become what she had destroyed. Rachel tried to shut out their voices, but each word lodged like a thorn. The sheriff strode forward, soot streaking his face, hat clenched in his hands. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze heavy. Ledger's gone. Fire took it clean. But you understand, girl, without proof, without names, the law has nothing. Nothing but stories. Rachel's voice cracked as she answered. Stories are all we ever had. And she used them to bind you. Maybe now you'll use them to free yourselves. The sheriff frowned, but he didn't argue. He turned away, leaving her alone once more. Rachel rose on unsteady legs, walking closer to the ashes. Charred beams jutted from the rubble like broken bones. Among the ruins, she spotted a glint of metal half buried in soot. She knelt, fingers trembling as she unearthed it. A clasp, blackened but intact, the ledger's binding. Her chest tightened. Even destroyed, it left a trace, a relic that could either condemn her or remind them all what had burned. She slipped it into her pocket, unsure if she carried a curse or a key. By noon the townsfolk began to scatter. Some returned to their homes in silence. Others lingered long enough to give her a look. Pity, anger, or fear, but no one offered her a hand. Rachel realized they were not ready to face life without Eleanor's shadow. They had depended on her order, her ledger of debts and secrets, even as it strangled them. Now they stood at a crossroads, and she had forced it upon them. Whether they would rise or crumble was no longer in her control. She walked down the dirt road, past faces that turned away, past neighbors who once waved but now lowered their eyes. Each step felt heavier, as though she carried the ashes of the house on her back. Children peered at her from windows, wide-eyed, their mothers pulling them back into the dark. The town was hers, and not hers anymore. That evening Rachel sat by the river, staring at the water's slow current. She clutched the blackened clasp, its edges sharp against her palm. She thought of her mother, of laughter in the kitchen before everything soured. She thought of Eleanor's final words, echoing in the roar of the flames. They will remember me. And Rachel wondered, was that true? Could fire erase a legacy, or did it only turn it to smoke that hung in the air forever? A sound broke her thoughts, footsteps on the riverbank. She turned sharply, heart racing. It was Mrs. Dalton, the seamstress, a woman who had once sewed Rachel's Sunday dress as a girl. The older woman's eyes were swollen with tears, her face pale. She hesitated before speaking. You were right to do it, she whispered. I was in her book. She had my husband's debts, my son's shame. I never had the courage. But you, her voice cracked. You ended it. Rachel searched her face. Then why do they all look at me like I'm cursed? Mrs. Dalton lowered her gaze. Because they're afraid. Because if you could break her, you could break them too. She placed a trembling hand on Rachel's shoulder, then slipped away into the gathering dusk, leaving Rachel more unsettled than before. Night fell, and the ruined house smoldered like a dying beast. Rachel stood once more before it, her silhouette sharp against the glowing embers. She could leave tonight, walk away from the town that no longer claimed her. Or she could stay, live among the whispers and fear, bear the weight of what she had done until the town decided whether to hate her or follow her lead. Neither choice promised peace. Both carried a cost. The wind shifted, lifting a swirl of ash into the air. For a moment it looked like words, as though Eleanor's ledger still wrote itself across the sky. Rachel closed her eyes. Perhaps Eleanor had been right. Memory could not be burned. But perhaps Rachel had been right too. Fear could be. She opened her eyes, stepping forward into the ruin. The ground was hot beneath her boots, but she did not flinch. Somewhere beneath the ash, something new would grow. Whether it was freedom or another kind of shadow, she could not know. But it would no longer belong to Eleanor. The fire was gone, but its mark remained. So did Rachel. And that was enough for now.